Hello, everyone, and welcome to FaceTime with Leaders, powered by Directors Institute, World Council of Directors. I'm your host, Sunny Pancholi. Most people in finance and risk wear very serious faces. But today's guest wrote a book called The Magic of Bollywood and Accounting. I already know this is going to be a great conversation. Dr. Devang Trivedi has spent 30 years moving through finance, audit, risk management, business continuity, and data privacy. From CA firms in Mumbai to one of the largest banks in the Middle East, First Abu Dhabi Bank in Bahrain, where he serves as AVP Risk Management. He holds a doctorate in Management Studies, CISA certification, CIPPE, Privacy certification from IAPP, and multiple ISO lead auditor qualifications. And in 2024, he published his debut book. So please welcome Dr. Devang. So wonderful to have you here.
Thank you so much, Sunny, for that very warm and generous introductions. And thank you, Sunny, for setting such a gracious tone. It's a truly pleasure to have you here today. My journey has been shaped by learning, adaptability, and the support of many mentors and colleagues along the way from India, UAE, and Bahrain. From my early days in Mumbai to my current role in Bahrain, I strongly believe that knowledge has a value only when it is shared. Platform like this creates a space for collective learning, much like a good film, where every character adding a meaning to a story. I look forward to a meaningful exchange of idea and hope our discussion add a value to everyone who is listening. The growth accelerate when the learning is shared and not stored. Thank you once again for having me here.
All right, so let's dive right in, Dr. Devang. You started your career in 1993 as an audit clerk at a CA firm in Mumbai, and 30 years later, you are AVP Risk Management at one of the largest banks in the Middle East, with a doctorate, 5 ISO certifications, CISA, CIPPE, and a published book. Most people pick one lane. You seem to have genuinely enjoyed collecting new ones. So, what actually drives that? Is it ambition? Is it a curiosity? Or something else entirely?
See, that's a wonderful question. I think what has driven me all this year is a less ambition and more curiosity. A genuine desire to understand how the different organizations really work from the inside. Moving from a CA firm in Mumbai to FMCG, education, manufacturing, NBFC, consulting, and finally banking was never a calculated checklist. It was asking about what can the environment teach me that the previous one couldn't. Much like a Bollywood hero evolving across the stages, ये नया chapter मुझे क्या सिखा सकता है? One qualification was that truly changed how I think, not just what I know, was a CISA, Certified Information Security Auditor. It shifted my mindset from looking at the numbers in isolation to seeing system, controls, and interdependencies. जिंदगी एक स्क्रिप्ट नहीं है, ये हर सीन इम्प्रोवाइज करना पड़ता है. Like curiosity build capability beyond qualification. At HDB Financial Services Limited, I spent around 8 years of my experience, and that taught me how a strong financial controls enable a business growth rather than just restrict it. And when I was at a Kuwait Gold, adding a gold manufacturing setup, calculating a cost per carat, recovery from buffing loss, and working with the other departments gave me a grounding in precise and the process that no textbook could. One understanding or one unexpected role that taught me that was most of the consulting. It was forced me to see a problem through many organization lenses was very quickly. As you know, the expectation without perspective is a fragile, and perspective without expectation is incomplete. And walking across such a diverse sectors like fundamentally change how you see the risk and governance. Especially often look at the risk within the framework. Someone who has lived across the industries see how the risk migrate, transform, and hides. Sometimes in operations, sometimes in people, and sometimes even assumption that have gone unchallenged for the years. The breadth gives you the pattern of recognitions that no single domain ever can. and completing my DMS, that is the Doctorate in Management Service Studies, in Jan 2025, while remaining actively engaged in the professional practice, as well as reflects my core belief that the learning and doing must happen simultaneously without one the weekends both. After the 30 years of my journey, I have learned this. The breaks build a perspective, outlook. And even the perspective has taught me the humility, adaptability, and the joy of never stopping learning about myself. पिक्चर अभी बाकी है मेरे भाई, लर्निंग कभी खत्म नहीं होती. That's that's
Absolutely. So, what a great start. What a great start to this conversation. And I must say, CA firm in 1993 to AVP Risk at Fab in Bahrain, and a published book somewhere in the middle. I think what strikes me most is that you never stopped being curious. And in risk management, especially that curiosity, that instinct to always ask what could go wrong and why is probably your greatest professional asset. So great. Uh, all right. So moving the conversation ahead, Dr. Devang, you have been at Abu Dhabi First Bank since 2020, first as BCM Specialist and now as AVP Risk Management. FAB is one of the largest banks in the Middle East. In 2020, when you joined, the world was in the middle of COVID, arguably the greatest business continuity test any organization has faced in the modern history. So, what was it actually like to be the person responsible for business continuity at a major bank when the pandemic hit?
See, as you know, the COVID period, what was that? The 1 year we spent like across in India. I was there in the UAE with my family, so I was know the lockdown and all these things. Okay. So to answer your questions, it's honestly it was intense and very human. When I joined FAB in July 2020, the COVID wasn't a scenario on a paper. It was unfolding in real time. Every assumption we have tasted before for people, locations, availability was being challenged simultaneously. As a BCM specialist in a major bank, you feel a deep sense of responsibility because continuity is no longer theoretical. It directly affects the customer, staff, and financial stability. Implementing and strengthening a global BCMS during that period required a decision. No template could fully prepare for you. One critical decision that we have to make under the pressure was rapidly enabling a large-scale remote working for our critical functions while ensuring the security, control, resilience. It worked because the focus was not just on the technology, but the people, clear communication, and prioritizing and trust. COVID reinforces one truth to me. BCM is not a document, it's a living governance system. Designing scenario, coordinating with the people, coordinating with the business unit, and conducting a post-incident reviews as much as about the human behavior as a technical planning. One major gap the pandemic export industry-wise is over-reliance on a single point of resilience, especially the people and the third-party dependencies. The board or organization which treat a BCM as mere compliance, they are underestimated the real exposure. Documents don't measure the speed of failure, interdependency, or a human response. Without integrating a BCM into a risk acceptance, a risk appetite, and governance, the resilience gap remains the hidden until a crisis hits. That is the unpriced risk, visible only when the operations, trust, and liquidity are already under stress. Today, in my role as a AVP risk management, BCM connects directly to the risk appetite, RAF monitoring, and the board governance. My key message is simple. The operational resilience is not a compliance cost, it's a strategic investment. What many underestimate is that the resilience fails quietly long before it fails visibly. The role of governance is to catch it early. So,
Absolutely, absolutely, Dr. Trivedi. BCM is not a document, it is a living governance system that only reveals its quality when something goes wrong. And COVID was essentially the world's largest and most honest BCM audit. And the organizations that held up were those where the system was genuinely embedded, not just filed away in a folder somewhere. Great. So, Dr. Devang, tell me, you hold the CIPPE Certified Information Privacy Professional from Europe. For Europe, from IAPP. Data privacy has gone from a compliance topic to a genuine strategic and reputational issue for organizations globally. And we have seen it happen. British Airways fined 183 pound millions under GDPR. WhatsApp fined 225 million euros. Amazon fined 746 million euros. Now, these are not small numbers. From your experience as a privacy compliance officer, what are most organizations still getting fundamentally wrong about data privacy governance?
See, now we are moving from your first question, BCM and COVID, to the privacy ones. Okay, as I am a privacy professional certified. So, answer to your questions like what most of the organizations still fundamentally get wrong about the data privacy is that they treat it as an IT or cybersecurity problem rather than as an enterprise-wide governance responsibility. In reality, if you see, the serious privacy failure almost never start with the technology. They start with the process gaps, unclear ownership, poor data discipline, and the culture that doesn't truly understand how your personal data flows through the organization. Technology merely exposes those failures on a scale. And a repeated and the costly gap is the unclear ownership of a personal data across the business lines and the third parties where no one is clearly accountable for end-to-end process, data minimization, retention, and the lawful use of a breakdown, creating a regulatory, reputational, and the remediation cost that organization never budgeted for. When we look at the GDPR fine imposed on British Airways, WhatsApp, and Amazon's, whatever name you have taken, they weren't primarily punishable for a weak system, but they were penalized for a governance failure. The regulator were effectively saying and asking you, once you didn't know your data, you did not control it from the end to end, and the last one is that your leadership did not treat a privacy risk with the seriousness which is deserved. In a day-to-day across my risk framework like the RCSA, the risk policies, and the governance committee, one recurring gap I see the lack of clarity on the data ownership. Who is accountable for the personal data once it moves across the business lines or the vendor or the geographies? Many organizations or board, especially in the Indian companies which operated globally, are carrying a significant cross-border data transfer risk without the fully understanding its a regulatory and a reputational impact. The privacy governance must sit on the board risk register alongside a credit and liquidity and operational risk, not buried inside the IT project plan. My combinations of a CISA, privacy, and ISO framework give me a one clear view that the information risk is a systematic and cuts across the system, people, and process. It's never isolated. My message is simple. Before a regulator comes and asks you how well you are governed with your personal data, you should already asking yourself that do we know what data we hold, why we hold, who owns it, and what happened if it was misused tomorrow. So this was the simple message.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the fines are not about technology failures, they are about governance failures. That reframe changes everything. Because the organizations that are genuinely protected are not necessarily the ones with the most sophisticated cybersecurity. They are the ones where the board owns the privacy risk and the governance structure make that ownership real. Great. So, Dr. Devang, you monitor and report fraud risk at FAB. which means you are essentially watching for patterns that indicate someone somewhere is trying to exploit the system. Now, fraud in banking has changed dramatically. Digital fraud, synthetic identity fraud, internal fraud, cyber enabled financial crime, so forth and so on. So, from where you sit, what is the fraud risk that keeps you most alert right now? And what are banks not doing well enough about it?
It's a nice question. So you are moving from the COVID to BCM, BCM to privacy, now from privacy to the fraud. To answer your questions, the fraud risk that keeps me most alert right now is a AI-enabled and identity-driven fraud, particularly a synthetic identities combined with a social engineering, which make this risk different. Is that it doesn't break the system; it passes through it. Some of the risks like the deep fakes, automated scripting, behavior mimicry are now more sophisticated enough to look legitimate across the multiple control points. One pattern we increasingly watch is for a low value, well behaved activity over a time and slowly build a trust until the exposure becomes the material. There is a no single red flag. The risk emerge only when the pattern are connected across the system and time. The traditionally rule-based fraud detection simply wasn't designed for that level of distinctions. Where the organization are still not doing enough is a fraud risk culture in organization where commercial pressure discourage early escalation. Weak signals are ignored until they become a losses. The fraud risk like the KRI, RCSA work as a early warning point by spotting an unusual pattern, control weakness, and emerging trends early. They connect a small signals across the processing of time, allowing the time escalations. So potential fraud is identified and corrected before it turns into an actual financial losses. The key structural gap I see is that the fragmented ownership of fraud risk across the business, operation, and technology, which allows accountability to blur. At the organization or board level, fraud reporting must go beyond the losses numbers because the losses tell you what happened and not why it was allowed to happen. At organization and standard around timely escalation and avoiding the high risk audit findings, reflection of prevention mindset, not a reactory one. My message is simple: demand visibility into patterns, culture, and escalation, not just an incident, because a fraud almost and always become a scandal, not due to a lack of control, but because of the early warnings or signal, which uncomfortable to hear and easier to ignore. You know that the something we can call सब कुछ सामने है बस देखने की हिम्मत चाहिए. That's
Rightly said, Dr. Devang, and rightly put. All right, so moving forward to the next segment of questions, which is our quick fire round. These are going to be very interesting. You don't have to overthink, just the instinctive answers that first strikes your mind. So, are you ready for it?
yeah, always.
All right. So, here I shoot you with the first question. The most underrated skill in risk management, technical knowledge or reading people?
Obviously reading people, because you know when the system fails, but the culture decide whether the warnings are to be heard or to be ignored.
Nice. Next one. A bank that passes every audit but has a weak risk culture, or one with occasional findings but genuine accountability, which is actually safer.
Mm, the one with a genuine accountability, because finding can be fixed, but the culture is much harder to repair.
Absolutely great. Next one, the biggest myth about data privacy that most business leaders still believe. One answer.
See, already we discussed that the data privacy, it's considered to be an IT problem instead of it's a leadership or a governance problem.
All right. Next one, writing the Bollywood accounting book, harder or easier than your doctorate?
To be very honest, it was a harder because the doctor tasted my discipline and the book tasted my creativity and the courage.
All right. Okay. That's nice. Uh, Next one. One word that 30 years of managing other people's financial risk teaches you about human nature.
It's a predictable.
All right. Great. Okay. So that was all for the quick fire round. And thank you for playing along, Dr. Deva. Moving on to the next segment of questions, the governance failure nobody saw coming. So let me ask you, Dr. Devang, Silicon Valley Bank collapsed in March 2023, the second largest bank failure in US history. What made it particularly interesting from a risk governance perspective is that SVB had risk committees, audit functions, regulatory oversight, and compliance frameworks, and it still failed in 72 hours. You work in risk management at a major regional bank. So when you watch that unfold, what was the first thing you thought?
See, in 2023, when the SVB collapsed, my first reaction wasn't a shock at the speed, it was recognition of a pattern. As a risk professional, what hit immediately to me was that this was not a lack of framework failure, it was a culture and the governance failure. The SVB has a committee, models, reports on paper, it looks compliant. But somewhere along the way, the uncomfortable questions stop being asked without enough seriousness. What the collapse revealed very clearly is the difference between having a risk framework and the living one. In the current workplace, the distinction show up very every day in how the risk appear is debated, how escalation is encouraged, and how the deviation are challenged, even when the business performance is a strong. The one governance lessons I reinforced after the SVB was need to challenge the concentration and the liquidity assumptions continuously, especially when the markets appears stable. In observation, the warning signs were visible. The concentrated risk that was tolerated too long, IRR, the interest rate risk, that was underestimated, and the stress testing they did not fully imaging a speed and a scale. The RAF risk appetite framework and its monitoring exist precisely to the surface that slow building vulnerabilities before they become acute, but only if the committee treat them as a decision tool, not as a reporting formalities. So my message is clear. The risk committee cannot be an administrative checkpoint. In the current workplace, our focus on avoiding the high risk audit finding and ensuring the sustainability and the remediation reflects in a preventive mindset. And my closing thought for the every organization or member of this, you cannot be a audit culture. You are accountable for it. When the pressure arrives, the culture decide whether your risk framework actually protect you or quietly lets you fail.
Absolutely, absolutely, Dr. Devang. SVB had the framework. It failed because the culture around that framework had stopped asking the uncomfortable questions. And that is such an important distinction because you can audit a framework, but you cannot audit a culture. And the culture only reveals itself when the pressure arrives. And by then, for SVB, it was too late. Rightly said, Dr. Devang. Okay. All right. So before we wrap up, let me ask you: you are a valued member of the Directors Institute World Council of Directors. From your personal experience, what has being part of Directors Institute meant to you, and how has that boardroom perspective shaped the way you think about risk and governance now?
So being part of a Director Institute World Council of Director has been deeply meaningful for me. because it expands my thinking beyond the framework and control into the boardroom accountability. I am engaged not just to learn the governance theory, but to understand how the director actually think, how they balance the risk, strategy, and the long-term value across the industries. One movement that genuinely shifted my perspective was a discussion on the board responsibility and the crisis management risk, but to know the question that the management may hesitate to raise. That insight changed how I present the risk finding, less technical, more consequences oriented, always linked to a decision making. The boardroom lens has strongly influenced how I approach the risk committee, fraud governance, BCM oversight, and the privacy compliance. For example, I applied the institute insights to move a conversation from are we control compliant or do we meet the rules to are we comfortable in defending this risk if it is materialized. That shift alone evaluates the governance quality. The structure, accountability, and the long term thinking show me that the risk decisions shape an institution future, not just a compliance status. Only the board has the authority to set a tone, challenge assumption, and the balance risk with the strategy. The risk team normally acts as in the second line of defense, which normally informs or advise the board. But the board must own the outcomes. The institute helped me to translate my 30 years of experience of finance and risk governance into a boardroom, creditable leadership and identity. The bridge technical expertise and governance thinking, enabling me to engage confidentiality with the board on strategy, accountability, and the long term risk ownership, not just a control. The peer governance learning helps me to step back from the technical details and see the risk in terms of strategy, accountability, and the trade offs. It trains you to ask the question to a board must ask what could go wrong, what happened, what is the impact, who owns the data, not just whether the control exists or not. The risk financial professional or the governance education is what gives you the technical expertise to fill a strategic authority and the credibility voice that board table, the transforming skills from a function insight into the information leadership and the meaningful oversights.
Absolutely, Dr. Devang. Risk governance as a board responsibility, not a risk department one. That is the sentence that should be, printed at the top of every board risk committee agenda. Because the risk department can build the most sophisticated frameworks in the world, but if the board does not own the culture around it, or SVP happens. Great. So let me tell you, Dr. Devang, this has been a genuinely fascinating and surprisingly warm conversation, which, given that it was largely about risk, fraud, and bank collapses, is quite an achievement. So thank you so much for your honesty, your warmth, and for a career that is as rich and as interesting as the book title suggests.
See, the conversation like this matter because the governance and the resilience are often discussed in the technical terms, but at their core, they are deeply a human responsibility. I have been fortunate to learn from my colleagues, mentors, and the institute that believe me in asking the harder questions early, not after the something goes wrong. If there is one thing my journey has reinforced, it's this strong organization are always built not just on the framework but on the culture that encourage the honesty, curiosity, and the accountability. Like Hindi, if you say, रिस्क और लाइफ में एक ही रूल है, जो सच का सामना करेगा वही जीतेगा, क्योंकि डर के आगे जीत है. And I'm grateful for this opportunity to share this reflection. And I hope today's discussion is encourage the leaders and professional alike to keep us strengthening that culture Thank you, Director Institution and the World Council of Director, and special thanks to you, Sunny, and everyone who is listening. It's been an absolute pleasure to be here today. Thank you.
Likewise, and thank you once again, Dr. Devang. And to our listeners, whether you sit on a bank board, lead a risk function, manage compliance, or simply want to understand why organizations that look safe sometimes are not, today's message is this: risk governance is not about the framework, it is about the culture around the framework. The boards that ask uncomfortable questions when everything looks fine are the boards that do not get surprised when things go wrong. And the professionals who build that culture quietly, rigorously, and persistently are among the most valuable people in any financial institution. And of course, Dr. Devang Trivedi has spent 30 years being exactly that person. So we thank you once again for joining us, Dr. Devang. And this has been FaceTime with Leaders, powered by Directors Institute, World Council of Directors. I'm your host, Sani Pancholi, signing off for now. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay ahead.